Welcome to Empowering Workers, Federal Employees' Disability and Employment Rights and Social Security Disability for All.
Hello and welcome to Empowering Workers, Federal Employees' Disability and Employment Rights and Social Security Disability for All with Eric Alpines. Eric is a nationally recognized federal employment lawyer, mediator, and attorney business coach. He represents federal employees and acts as in-house counsel for over 50,000 federal employees through his work as a federal employee labor union representative. I am your host, Kevin Rosenquist, and today's episode is about federal employees and mental disability accommodations. We're going to talk about overcoming some barriers there. Eric, good to see you. Welcome back.
Hi, great to see you, Kevin.
Can you start by explaining what qualifies as a mental disability in the context of federal employment?
Basically, something that doesn't relate to your physical body, for example, doesn't relate to, let's say, your ability to walk or your ability to speak or your ability to see, or something that's tangibly physical. But more simply, examples would be PTSD, depression, anxiety, bipolar, certain psychological things, the type of thing you would generally go to a psychiatrist for.
How does the qualification differ from other types of disabilities? Is there a different process?
It's really interesting. In the federal government, I once did a whole, continuing education class for lawyers on the fact that there's about 5 or 6 different definitions of disability, depending on what you're trying to do in the federal government. For example, Social Security disability, which is something that we do in my firm, has a very strict definition of disability. You have to be really disabled, unable to do substantial gainful work. OPM disability retirement for federal employees is a little bit less strict. You just have to be unable to do your job you're assigned to. And then there's the disability definition for reasonable accommodation for EEO reasons, equal employment opportunity discrimination reasons. That's a very easy definition to meet because the law wants to protect all types of disabled people. So, and there's a workers' comp definition, there's one for VA benefits. There's so many different definitions of who's considered disabled and whether they're considered disabled. So many definitions that I don't even remember your question anymore. Just teasing you.
Yeah, I was just wondering I was talking about the process and how the qualification differs from other types of disabilities.
So I guess what I was getting at was it depends on what we're talking about. If we're talking about reasonable accommodation, which I think is generally kind of what we're talking about here, all of these conditions are likely to qualify as disabilities. It's a very lenient. There was something called the Americans with Disability Amendments Act that made it much easier many years ago to qualify as a disabled employee under the ADA, which is what the federal government uses through something called the Rehabilitation Act, but they use the same definition and it's very easy. So all these conditions would qualify for that. If we're talking about disability retirement for federal employees, generally those would qualify, but they'd be a little bit harder to prove. And Social Security, they also would qualify, but again, much harder to prove psychological conditions than physical.
You mentioned a few before. What are the most common mental disabilities that you see come through your office?
So we represent a lot of VA employees, and even without VA employees, a lot of people reach out to us with PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, because a lot of veterans have issues with that. A lot of people have stress in their life and it can lead to that. Anxiety probably comes next. We live in a very anxious generation, and it only gets, as the world speeds up and people expect us to work all hours, it gets more and more stressful. So those are probably the 2 main ones.
What kind of reasonable accommodations do federal employees with mental disabilities generally get? Like, what kind of adjustments do they try to make for their work environment?
A lot of them want to work from home some of the days, and there's a big difference between working home every day than a couple days. And right now with the political situation, nobody's allowed to work from home unless you have reasonable accommodations. So even though the government's forcing everyone to come back, I've done a few talks and blogs on the fact that you still have a right to work at home under the Rehabilitation Act, ADA. So working from home, harder to work 5 days from work at home. Working from home a couple days a week is easier. But if they're at work, at the office, additional break times, more flexible schedule, different times for coming in, things like that.
When requesting reasonable accommodations for a mental disability, they're harder, more difficult to show a lot of times mental disabilities, obviously, than physical ones. Is the process different? How do people find success when asking for reasonable accommodations with mental disabilities?
You really want a doctor to support you, because if you're blind, it's pretty obvious and the law protects you unless your supervisor thinks you're making it up. Or if you're deaf, or if there's something that's open and obvious, if you're missing a limb, if you have an open and obvious limp, that's, you're not faking it and that's obvious. Those are the type of things that the law, at least for the ADA, does not even require you to have proof from a doctor. But mental disability is something that goes on inside your brain. obviously. So that clearly requires proof from a doctor that you're not making it up, that it's legitimately been diagnosed either through the DSM-5 or whatever different system that your medical provider uses.
What are some of the common challenges that employees with mental disabilities face when they request accommodations?
Well, people don't take them seriously many times. A lot of people think, well, I'm stressed, like the supervisor, I should say, or the reasonable accommodation coordinator. I have stress, but I don't need an accommodation. So a lot of people, if you don't see an open and obvious injury, their own personal biases come into play.
Right.
And sometimes they just won't take you seriously, or they'll just deny your accommodation. And even with the medical providers, it happens a lot. That's why we see a lot of clients here.
Yeah, I feel like we've gotten so much better about mental illness and mental disabilities as a society over the years, but it's still like maybe a stigma attached to it. There's maybe a question in your mind whether they're faking it or if it's really that bad, or, we see people with emotional support animals that are strange, and we kind of like, there's a lot of different viewpoints on this. Do you feel like the overall look at mental well-being in the federal workforce is getting more attention, less attention, the same?
I mean, a little of that has to do with the political climate, who was in office at the time, but I think through the years it's gotten better. It definitely has. Like even now, when the political climate is very much pro-management and not as much pro-employee, you don't see very little time and effort being put into cracking down on reasonable accommodation laws. That's for sure, or even discussions about it. So I think it's gotten better through the years. But I mean, the reality is, nobody wants people to take advantage of the system and harm those people who are legitimately disabled. So I personally think the government has a right to ask for proof. Now, once they get that proof, that's when they have to stop putting their own opinions and their own situation. Let's say they've toughed it out in their life, or they have a stronger constitution. So they can't really put themselves in the place of other people. I mean, they shouldn't, I should say. To answer your question though, I would say it's gotten better, but at the same time, it's always going to be much harder to prove psychological conditions than it is to prove physical disability.
Do the mental disability claims get denied more often in your experience?
Oh, yes. And that's why we see a lot of them, because they're on appeal, or people know that they need some help. Hopefully they do, from an attorney, to really cross the T's and dot the I's and get the medical together. Because if not, the government they're not going to allow it, or and they shouldn't, because it'll open up the floodgates to people taking advantage, in my opinion. So That being said, they should look at the appeals and they should look at the correct applications correctly, but they shouldn't. I noticed that, and I don't know if this is an official rule. I don't know if anyone from OPM is ever going to watch this video, but I've always felt like you never want to say that your supervisor is the reason why you're stressed when you're applying for disability retirement, or when you're requesting reasonable accommodation. Actually, when requesting reasonable accommodation, it's specifically, you can't ask to be transferred away from your supervisor, because otherwise everyone's going to say, my supervisor stresses me out. I mean, I own my own business and my supervisor stresses me out all the time. So he's a little voice in the back of my head. But in all seriousness, though, it's definitely something that I think it should be taken a little more seriously, I guess is what I'm saying.
Is the appeals process different for a mental disability?
Not at all. Everything is exactly the same, just a lot harder to get it through than it is with a physical one.
Okay. You mentioned doctor, getting the backing of a doctor to help strengthen your case. Is there anything else that someone could do to strengthen their case with a mental disability?
Make sure the doctor has done diagnostic tests. That's really the gold standard.
Okay. So can you elaborate on that a little bit?
There are different tests, out there that for different conditions. There's so many different conditions. A lot of times, people are looking for a true diagnosis. Like I said, I don't know if it's a DSM-5 or 6 or whatever number they're on now. It could be a DSM type diagnosis. It should be that they gave them ideally some type of objective test, even though objective tests are not so clear when it comes to psychology. I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but there are tests out there that are available, which I'm not an expert in, but when I see them in my applications, I feel like I have a much stronger case for my client.
I thought it was interesting that you said, don't blame your supervisor if you're stressed, because it just makes it look like is it just because it makes it look like you're being petty and you're just like, I don't like my supervisor, so I'm going to claim that he's stressing me out. Is that kind of the thought process that people have when they hear that?
I think so. And I think it would open up the floodgates to everybody who's stressed out by their supervisor applying and getting disability. And I don't think anybody wants that, but we all get stressed out by our supervisors if we're normal and we're human.
Yeah.
Even the perfect supervisor, they're expecting work from you. So by its very nature, it creates stress. So
are there certain mental disabilities that are easier to get than others? Because I feel like stress would be a tough one to to prove that you are so stressed that you need special accommodations. Because to your point earlier, I mean, we're all stressed. We live in an anxious world. We're highly medicated, and we struggle as a society. So is that something that is easy to get? I don't know, to get disability for?
No, it's not. You're right. Stress is one of the hardest, but usually you rarely find stress by itself. It's usually with depression, because stress can lead to depression. So if you have a diagnosis of major depressive syndrome, if someone called me up and said, "Can you represent me for disability retirement I just have anxiety," I would probably not take the case.
So to kind of close things up here, what rights do federal employees with mental disabilities have if their accommodations are not provided, or if the accommodations are inadequate?
If they qualify as somebody who's disabled, and if the agency can accommodate them, give them an accommodation that allows them to do their essential functions, then they can file a discrimination case for failure to accommodate. EEO case, that's something my firm does. So they don't need a firm to do it. They can do it on their own. If they cannot be accommodated because their condition is so severe, they can apply for both Social Security disability, and they can apply for disability retirement for federal employees. You could see a previous podcast to know about the differences there. One's harder than the other. But to make a long story short, there's tons of options. And that's why it's great to do a case review and talk to an attorney about, what it is that you want to accomplish, and they'll help you accomplish it.
With a mental disability, is it even more important to have an attorney in your mind?
I would say it's all the more so, because it's just the reasons we've been talking about the entire podcast, that people are going to disbelieve you, and you need somebody to cross the T's and dot the I's.
Makes sense. All right. Well, thank you for tuning into Empowering Workers, Federal Employees, Disability and Employment Rights, and Social Security Disability for All with Eric L. Pines. To connect with Eric, head to pinesfederal.com, and please like and subscribe to our channel and leave us a review. Eric, always great seeing you. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Take care.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.